Some people have spent their entire lives putting others first. Not because they're selfless saints, not because they don't have their own needs, but because somewhere deep inside, they learned that their worth depends on making other people happy. They say yes when they mean no. They apologize for things that aren't their fault. They twist themselves into shapes that fit other people's expectations while their own desires go unspoken, unmet, unacknowledged. This is people-pleasing. And it doesn't come from nowhere. There is a psychology behind chronic people-pleasing. And for most people-pleasers, it started long before they had the language to understand what was happening. It started in childhood, with the people who were supposed to teach them that their needs mattered. Their parents. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but through patterns, reactions, and emotional dynamics that taught a child one clear message. Your job is to manage my emotions, meet my needs, and keep the peace, even at the cost of yourself. Psychologists call this conditional love. When a child learns that affection, approval, and safety depend on being good, being quiet, being helpful, being whatever the parent needs them to be. And that child grows into an adult who can't say no, who feels guilty for having boundaries, who believes that their value lies in how much they can do for others. People-pleasers are not weak. They are not pushovers. They are not naturally selfless. They are survivors of an emotional environment where pleasing others was the price of belonging. But here's the complicated part. Most parents who create people-pleasers don't realize they're doing it. They're not villains. They're often struggling themselves with their own unmet needs, their own wounds, their own inability to regulate emotion. And they unconsciously pass that burden to their child. The child who learns to read the room, manage moods, anticipate needs, and suppress themselves to keep everyone else comfortable.
That's not love. That's emotional labor a child should never have to carry. I remember the exact moment I realized I was a people pleaser. Someone asked me what I wanted for dinner, and I panicked. Not because I didn't know, but because I was so trained to figure out what they wanted and align with it, that accessing my own preference felt dangerous. I'd spent so long being the easy one, the flexible one, the one who didn't cause problems, that I'd lost touch with what I actually wanted. That's when I understood this wasn't my personality. This was survival programming from childhood that I'd carried into adulthood without question. People-pleasing is not generosity. It's a nervous system response to early relational trauma. And that is something most people-pleasers have never been told. There is a specific psychology shared by most people-pleasers. They have heightened attunement to others' emotions combined with suppressed awareness of their own. They can read a room instantly. They know when someone's mood shifts. They sense disapproval, frustration, or disappointment before it's even spoken. But ask them how they feel, what they need, what they want, and they freeze, because those questions were never safe to answer honestly. Every interaction gets filtered through one question: what do they need from me right now? Not what do I need, not what feels right to me, just how do I keep them happy so I stay safe? Scientific studies show that people-pleasers often have hyperactive mirror neuron systems, elevated cortisol from chronic stress, and patterns consistent with anxious attachment and fawn trauma response. Their people-pleasing is not a choice. It's a learned survival mechanism that once kept them emotionally or physically safe. But the environment that required it is often long gone, and the pattern remains, running their life from the background. Sometimes the world mislabels them. You're too nice. You need to stand up for yourself. Just say no. As if it's that simple. As if decades of conditioning can be undone with a decision. But people pleasers can't just say no, any more than someone with a phobia can just relax. The nervous system is involved. The survival brain is activated. Saying no feels like danger, like abandonment, like proof they're selfish, bad, unlovable. Yet many of the most empathetic, caring, deeply feeling people are people pleasers. They're not doormats. They're people who were taught that their survival depended on managing everyone else's comfort.
Maybe that's the hidden truth. People-pleasing is not weakness. It's hyper-responsibility learned in childhood. It teaches you to read people with incredible accuracy. It teaches you to be helpful, considerate, attuned. But it also teaches you that your needs are less important than everyone else's. Still, here's the question. If people-pleasing comes from parents, what exactly did they do? Sometimes it was conditional approval. Love and attention were given when the child was good, compliant, helpful, achieving, and withdrawn when they weren't. The child learned, I am only valuable when I please you. My needs are an inconvenience. My worth is performance-based. Sometimes it was emotional volatility. A parent who was unpredictable, loving one moment, angry the next. The child never knew which version they'd get. So they learned to monitor, adapt, soothe. They became emotional managers, trying to keep the parent regulated so they could feel safe. Sometimes it was parentification. The child became the parent's emotional support, confidant, or caretaker. They were praised for being so mature or such a good helper. But what they really were was a child doing an adult's emotional labor, and they learned their role was to take care of others, not be taken care of. Sometimes it was neglect. Needs went unmet. Emotions went unacknowledged. The child learned that asking for things led to disappointment or rejection. So they stopped asking. They became low maintenance. They learned to meet their own needs and everyone else's too. Sometimes it was enmeshment. The parent had no boundaries. The child's feelings, thoughts, and choices were treated as extensions of the parent's. The child learned, I don't get to be separate. My job is to reflect what you need me to be. My identity is your comfort. Sometimes it was criticism and shame. Nothing the child did was quite good enough. There was always something to improve, correct, or criticize. The child learned, I am fundamentally flawed. I must constantly try harder, do more, be better to earn acceptance. And sometimes it was subtle. No dramatic abuse, just a quiet, pervasive message, your needs are too much, your emotions are inconvenient, be easier. And the child became easier, until they disappeared. But here's what most people don't understand. Parents who create people pleasers are often people pleasers themselves. This pattern passes down through generations. A parent who never learned boundaries can't teach them. A parent who suppressed their own needs will unconsciously teach their child to do the same. It's not an excuse, but it is context. If you are a people pleaser, you probably spent your childhood being praised for the very things that are now destroying you. You're so helpful, You never complain. You're the easy one. You were rewarded for self-abandonment and punished through withdrawal, disappointment, or anger for having needs. You learned young that love is conditional, that your value is based on utility, that relationships require you to shrink. And now, as an adult, you can't stop. You say yes to things you don't want to do. You apologize when you've done nothing wrong. You overextend yourself trying to make everyone happy while your own life falls apart. You feel guilty for resting, for saying no, for prioritizing yourself even slightly. Because somewhere inside, that child is still trying to earn love by being good enough, helpful enough, selfless enough. But what if that child was lied to? What if love was never supposed to be earned? What if you were always enough and the adults around you just couldn't see it? Let me shift for a moment from talking about them to talking as one of them. I spent 20 years of my life being the person everyone could count on. The one who didn't complain, the one who accommodated, the one who made things easier for everyone else. And I was exhausted, resentful, disconnected from myself. Because I didn't know how to exist without a role to play, without someone else's needs to meet, without the validation that came from being useful. I thought people-pleasing was who I was, that I was just naturally selfless and accommodating. But then I started tracing it back, and I saw the pattern. I saw the parent who needed me calm when they were stressed, who needed me successful to reflect well on them, who needed me to not be a problem because they couldn't handle one more thing. I learned young, my needs are burden. My emotions are too much. My job is to be easy. And I became so easy, I disappeared. That's when I realized this wasn't my nature. This was my adaptation, and I could change it. And now it's time to talk directly to you. Because maybe you are a people pleaser. Maybe you've spent your whole life putting yourself last and calling it kindness. Maybe you can't remember the last time you said no without guilt, the last time you prioritized yourself without apologizing. Maybe you're exhausted from carrying everyone else's emotional weight while your own needs go unmet. But you know what? You are not selfish for having boundaries. You are not mean for saying no. You are not difficult for having needs. You are a person, and people are allowed to matter to themselves. Because the truth is, people pleasers are not naturally selfless. They are trained to self-abandon. They learned early that their worth was conditional, that love had to be earned, that their value was in what they could do for others, not in who they were. Psychologists say the people-pleasing is a fawn trauma response, one of the 4 survival responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. When fighting back wasn't safe and running away wasn't possible, fawning was the answer. Appease the threat. Make yourself useful. Become what they need so they don't hurt you. Your people-pleasing is not a character flaw. It's evidence of how hard you worked to survive an environment that didn't feel safe. It doesn't mean your parents were monsters. It means they were human, flawed, limited, unable to give you what you needed. And you adapted brilliantly. You survived. But survival strategies that work in childhood become prisons in adulthood. There are moments when people-pleasing feels like love, when helping others brings genuine joy, when being considerate feels natural. And there are moments when it feels like a cage, when you can't say no, when resentment builds, when you realize you don't know who you are underneath the role. Let's go deeper into the psychology behind people-pleasing.
Number 1, anxious attachment. Many people pleasers developed anxious attachment in childhood. They learned that closeness was inconsistent, so they must work constantly to maintain it. Their worth feels tied to their usefulness. If they stop pleasing, they fear abandonment. Number 2, fawn trauma response. Fawning is a survival mechanism where you appease a threat to avoid harm. In childhood, the threat might have been a parent's anger, disappointment, or withdrawal. The child learns, if I make them happy, I stay safe. Number 3, parentification. When children are made responsible for a parent's emotional needs, they develop a hyper-responsibility for others' feelings. They become caretakers before they've been cared for. Number 4, boundary violations. When a child's no is ignored, overridden, or punished, they learn that boundaries are dangerous, that saying no leads to conflict or rejection, so they stop saying it. Number 5, conditional positive regard by Carl Rogers. When love and acceptance are given only when the child meets certain conditions, they learn to perform for affection. They don't develop inherent self-worth, only worth based on what they do. But here lies a paradox. People pleasers often give the most while feeling the emptiest. They're surrounded by people who rely on them, need them, appreciate them, but they feel unseen because no one knows the real them, the one with needs, limits, and desires. They've spent so long being what others need that they've lost touch with what they need.
If you've ever felt lonely while surrounded by people you help constantly, you understand this. You're not seen. You're useful, and those are not the same thing. Yet people-pleasing doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It means you learned a strategy that no longer serves you, and strategies can be unlearned. Here's something personal, and maybe you'll relate. The first time I said no without apologizing or explaining, I felt sick. My body was convinced something terrible was about to happen, that I'd be rejected, punished, abandoned. But nothing happened. The person said, "Okay," and moved on. And I realized the danger I was feeling was from the past. The punishment I feared was from a dynamic that no longer existed. My nervous system was still protecting me from a threat that was gone. And slowly, I started to learn. I can have boundaries and still be loved. I can prioritize myself and still be good. I can say no, and the world doesn't end. Still, the world will always try to convince you otherwise. Society rewards people pleasers. It calls them selfless, kind, generous. But it never acknowledges the cost, the exhaustion, the resentment, the self-abandonment. You may be a people pleaser, but that doesn't mean you have to stay one. This pattern was taught, and what was taught can be untaught. It's not easy. Your nervous system will resist. The guilt will feel overwhelming. The fear of rejection will scream. But your worth is not based on what you do for others. It never was. That was a lie you were told when you were too young to question it. And because you were a people pleaser, you developed gifts: deep empathy, emotional attunement, the ability to read people and respond to needs. Those gifts are real, but they don't require self-abandonment to be valuable. You can be kind without sacrificing yourself. You can be helpful without losing yourself. You can care about others while also caring about you. You're the person who makes everyone else feel seen, who shows up when people need support, who gives generously even when you're empty. And maybe that makes you valuable to others, but you were always valuable, even before you did a single thing for anyone.
There is a painful truth people pleasers must face. The people who benefit from your people pleasing will resist your boundaries. They've gotten used to a version of you that prioritizes them, and when you stop, they'll call it selfish. But their discomfort is not your responsibility. You are not responsible for managing their emotions. You never were. So let me talk to you directly now, clearly, honestly. You are not selfish for having needs. You are not mean for saying no. You are not difficult for wanting your feelings to matter. You are a person who was taught that your value is conditional, and that teaching was wrong. Your parents, intentionally or not, taught you that love must be earned, that your needs are too much, that your worth is based on what you provide. But you don't have to keep living that lie. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to disappoint people. You are allowed to prioritize yourself without guilt. One day, you'll say no and not feel sick. You'll prioritize yourself and not apologize. You'll set a boundary and feel relief instead of terror. And that day will be evidence that you're healing. Until then, start small. Notice when you're saying yes, but mean no. Notice when you're apologizing for existing. Notice when you're twisting yourself into shapes to fit someone else's needs. And ask yourself, what would I do if I mattered to myself as much as I matter to everyone else? Because people who were made into people pleasers aren't broken. They're adapted to survive environments that required them to disappear. And now they get to learn something new, that they were always enough, that their needs are not too much, that love does not have to be earned. Keep questioning the pattern. Keep noticing the cost. Keep remembering that you matter, not for what you do, but for who you are. Because your parents made you a people pleaser, but you don't have to stay one. You can choose yourself. Even if it feels terrifying, even if people are disappointed, even if the guilt is overwhelming, you can choose yourself. And that choice is where your freedom begins.